Welcome to the Dali Museum this morning. We're glad to see so many are with us. We're all here for Coffee with the Curator, which we do on the first Wednesday of every month. We are very happy to have you with us. I want to thank Cafe Gala for providing refreshments, so hopefully you got to take advantage of that. And we want to thank both AARP and the City of St. Petersburg for sponsoring conversations at the Dali, and events like this are Coffee with a Curator. If you're here from AARP, welcome. We are glad to have you with us. Quick reminder, always a reminder, please silence your cell phones. If you do have a cell phone, we're very happy about that, but we would prefer not to have the musical accompaniment through the talk. And we do have a couple things coming up that I want you to be aware of. Next Monday, we are having a performance by Roxanne Fay, who is well known here in the area, great actress. She is doing My Unspeakable Confessions, Gala Dali Declines to Explain Herself. It's a single act, one-person performance, and it's really a wonderful introduction to the very strange and curious world of Dali's wife, Gala. So if you can join us for that, that'll be great. Next Thursday, Poetry returns to the Dali. It is a free event at 6 p.m. I invite you to join us for that. We have a gentleman, Aaron Schulman, who just published a book about Leopoldo Pinero, Spanish poet, and his family, a very unusual and very difficult, surprisingly complex family of literary figures who lived through the Franco era. That he's going to be talking about his book and going to be presenting a documentary from 1970 that was made about him. That is a free event on Thursday the 26th. And last but not least, next month for Coffee with a Curator, because it's October, I'm going to be talking about Dali and the Dead. So hope you will join us for that. But of course, we are here today for Denise's talk. And let me just get this on the screen. Slideshow from current slide. That didn't work. Let's go one more. This should work. Slideshow and nope. One more, so close. Maybe, there we go, okay. So I'm very happy that you're all here for this talk today. This will be the first talk by Denisse De Leon, my colleague in education. I want to tell you a little bit about her. She has her master's in art history with a concentration in museum studies from the University of Richmond, Virginia. She also worked at the Virginia Museum of Art as well as the Richmond Museums, and she specialized in K through 12 education, which served her well when she went on to the Glazier Museum. She's been with us for 2 years. She is in charge of our junior docent program, our teen designer program, Teen Voices, and she is now one of our facilitators for the Innovation Labs. So with that, please join me in welcoming Denisse De Leon.
All right, good morning, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay? Great, I'm just a tidge shorter than Peter. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming out today, everybody in the theater who's listening, as well as everybody who's listening online. Hi, Mom. Hi, Sam. This talk has really been about 3 years in the making. Self-portraiture and portraiture in general has been a passion of mine, all the way from undergrad to my career here at the Dali. So when the chance came to give a coffee with the curator, it just felt like a very natural fit to focus on Dali's self-portrait. Dali has over 40 self-portraits. We're not going to talk about all of them today just because we only have an hour. So what we're going to focus on is what I like to call the ones that are the most provocative in understanding Dali's evolution of self-representation. There's also very little research on Dali's self-portraits. There was an exhibit back in 2008 done by the foundation. And pretty much that's been the only exploration there's ever been about his self-portraits. So I kind of had to start from scratch, which was both very daunting but also really exciting. And so I hope to share with you some of the theories that came up during my research. So to start us off, this quote I think really encompasses what we'll be talking about today. To speak of self-portraiture in Dali's work is in an important sense redundant, as Salvador Dalí, the man, the artist, and the person, is the privileged subject and object of his life's work. I think this really sets the stage for understanding the dynamic of Dali's self-representation throughout his career. And I just want to focus a minute also on the title of the talk, the fact that it's called The Man Behind the Mask. This quote, I think, speaks beautifully to that. Do we ever really know who Salvador Dalí is, and does his self-portraiture actually portray that? We'll be talking about that more today. And also the fact that I talk about the soft self-portrait, it's really the fact that Dalí's definition of self-portrait is soft and malleable. So let's take a step back, though, before we dive into Dalí, and let's just establish a little bit more background on what self-portraiture is. And this is an old trick from my undergrad days. I always like to pull out the dictionary definition of a term that I'm using. So self-portrait is defined as a portrait of oneself done by oneself. But there are, in fact, of course, many functions to self-portraiture. It can be an exercise in self-examination, the way that the artist includes his signature in the work, an advertisement for artistic skills, and an opportunity for experimentation with new techniques. And it's safe to say that Dalí did all of these things. The first portrait, arguably in art history, is actually John van Eyck's The Arnolfini Portrait. And you can see the artist reflected in the mirror in the background. So the two figures in the front are not the artist, just a tiny little reflection in the background. Now, why wasn't it until the 1400s that self-portraiture came to exist? One of the reasons was, in the medieval time, piety was very important, and so we didn't want to have a self-aggrandized version of ourselves in the art that we were creating. It all had to do with our faith and with worship. Another reason would be that flat mirrors didn't exist. The only mirrors that existed were concave, so that proved an interesting challenge for artists. And it wasn't until the flat mirror was invented in Venice that we really see an uptick in seeing self-portraits. Another reason, too, would be that artists were considered to be craftspeople. They didn't have the level of reputation and awe that we give to that title today. So we're going to jump in time to 100 years later, and we have Parmigianino, self-portrait in a convex mirror. And we're not hiding anymore. The artist isn't hiding in the back of the background. He's front and center here. And actually, this was a piece that he sent to the Vatican in order to gain commissions. So he's using his self-portrait as advertisement. So to further understand Dalí's self-portrait, we need to understand different traditions that run through the history of self-portraiture. And the first one that we're going to discuss is artist in disguise. In Artist in Disguise, we're going to see very theatrical elements and scenes where the artist is literally, as the title says, hidden, disguised in a costume within a larger composition. And it was a chance for artists to maybe experiment with different poses. If they didn't have models, they could use themselves. And now we have mirrors, so it's an exciting time. The first one that I wanted to show as an example is Michelangelo's The Last Judgement, St. Bartholomew. He is that melted body that you see there hanging from the cloud. St. Bartholomew was a martyr who is said to have been skinned alive. And by the time Michelangelo is painting this altarpiece at the Sistine Chapel, he's much later on in his career. He's lived quite a rebellious life, let's say. And it could be said that he's kind of projecting that idea of redemption and hopefulness in life after death by presenting himself as a martyr. And I want you guys to hold on to that image because we'll be talking about it more in a couple of Dalí's self-portraits. Next up is Caravaggio, another source of inspiration for Dalí. He has painted himself as the head of Goliath. And Caravaggio, much like Michelangelo, also had a bit of a rebellious bad boy streak to him. A couple years earlier, he had been accused of murder and he had been banished from Rome. And so he actually painted this work and sent it again to the Vatican in hopes that it would secure him a pardon, which it ultimately did. So the next tradition that we're going to talk about is artist at work. This tradition is really about presenting that idea of what an artistic genius is. So we've moved away from artists as craft person, and we're really treating them as unique geniuses amongst us. It also is a function of advertising and showing off skill. and a record of artistic development. We'll see some examples of that. And it really helps, again, elevate that idea of the artist as a special role within our society. So we'll focus on two artists here who were also sources of inspiration for Dalí. First one up is Rembrandt, Self-Portrait with Two Circles. Rembrandt was a prolific producer of self-portraits. This work is later on in his career. You see the master with the tools of his trade, and then he's sneakily showing off a bit to us with those two very perfect circles that you can see painted in the background. And Rembrandt, again, another source of inspiration for Dalí. Vincent van Gogh also did many self-portraits, but his have a bit of a different tone to them. Van Gogh struggled throughout his entire life to be recognized as an artist. So for him to show himself at the easel with the tools of his trade was a way of him saying, having some self-validation, let's say, for his role as an artist. Okay, the final tradition that we're going to talk about is artist as symbol. And I'm going to make the argument that Dalí actually helped establish this tradition within self-portraiture. This tradition also takes a much more psychoanalytical and self-reflective tone. And the first example up is a fellow surrealist, Max Ernst. Loplop introduces Loplop. Loplop was Ernst's alter ego. And as a student of Freud, that sense of trying to understand what's happening in our unconscious was very important to him. And then, curiously, Frida Kahlo comes to this tradition as well, though it is argued that she had not read Freud. So for her, it takes a little bit of a different spin. This painting, What I Saw in the Water, was actually in our Frida show that we had here at the museum a few years ago. And she's surrounded by symbols that are very autobiographical and very meaningful to her. So less about the subconscious, about being psychoanalytical, and much more reflective about the self. And finally, that brings us to Dalí. So now that we have this strong foundation in understanding the traditions within, and these aren't all of them, of course, within self-portraiture, let's talk about how Dalí fits into this larger story. So the first period, and I've divided his career into three periods, helps us understand Dalí's search for identity. This is going to take us from his teen and college years all the way up to right before he becomes a member of the Surrealist movement. And it's Dalí, as many of us do when we're teens, trying to figure himself out and trying to attempt a personal and artistic self-affirmation. It conveys a pretty narcissistic image of himself as he's trying to exalt his own perceived individuality, his own crafted individuality. And this will all make a little bit more sense once we dive in. So his very first self-portrait is from 1918. It's pretty shocking to think that Dalí was only 14 years old when he painted this. What's really unique about this painting to me is that even though it is a self-portrait, we aren't seeing Dalí's face. We're just seeing an artist at work. Really fits into that tradition. And Dalí, as a young artist himself, is looking to other artists as sources of inspiration. Specifically, he's looking at the Fauvist. And here we have Open Window by Matisse. And here we have the colors really jumping out at us, very bright, unsaturated colors that are not mixed together, and Dalí is really echoing those bright colors in his composition. What's also very unique about this painting is the technical know-how it would have taken to actually create it. The hours that Dalí would have spent to put the mirrors in the correct location so that he could see his reflection. And a special thanks to Yvonne, who's out in the crowd. Hey, Yvonne. And her son, who spent a day trying to figure this out for us so that we could have this wonderful image to show in talks like this. All right. The next painting that we're going to be discussing is the artist in his studio. And the location of this is unknown, which is why we have this not so great image of it. But the reason I wanted to show it is because the title suggests that it was painted in the Pichot's household. Dalí's family summered in Caravaggio in Spain, which was a seaside town. Again, we have the open window with a water view in the background, but now we actually get to see Dalí's face, and we're starting to see kind of what are the features that he's choosing to really make stand out for us. So the sideburns, the bold brow, and we'll touch on those a little bit more in a bit. But the Pichots were the Dalí family's neighbors. They were a group of musicians and artists, and one of them in particular, Rembrandt Pichot, was a sort of mentor for Dalí in his early career, and Pichot was an impressionist painter. So this is actually an example of his work that you'll see on the screen, of a view of Caravaggio. Unknown who the woman is who's posing in this painting. It could be speculated that it's Anna Maria, since she was such a frequent model for Dalí during this time in his life. Okay, so Self-Portrait 1920. Again, we're seeing a continuation of Dalí's impressionistic style, those bold brows, those big sideburns. And what I find really beautiful about this work is how it really seems to be directly quoting, in a way, Renoir's paintings, and that dappling of light that is so present in his work that Dalí is working on incorporating into his style. And we have a lovely quote from his diary that tells us a bit about this fascination with Impressionism. It's a letter that he wrote to his uncle. I won't read all of it, but I will call your attention to the fact that I realize more and more how difficult art is, but also every day I rejoice and like it. I keep on admiring the great French Impressionists, Manet, Degas, Renoir. I wish they would become the most strong guiding force in my life, and it could be argued that at the time they definitely were. But also within that letter, there's a great line that says, "The portrait interests me more and more every day, although I approach it, technically speaking, like a landscape, still life, or wine cellar study." To me, that line is saying that portraiture for Dalí, or self-portraiture for Dalí, is an exercise that he needs to master in order to become an artist. And it might explain why he was so prolific in creating self-portraits in this early period of his career. So the next painting that we'll talk about is Self-Portrait from 1920. The reverse of this work has the landscape that I've included in this slide painted on the back. We are a teen artist, so coming up with materials must have been hard, so Dalí was frugal in this instance and used both sides. But it's such a curious depiction of himself, and I have a couple theories as to what's inspiring him. One of them is that he is looking at Caravaggio's Bacchus. The idea for that connection comes from some visual clues that we have in the painting, like the grapes that are hanging in the corner. It could be said that he's wearing a toga, and then the pose where his head is turned seems very similar to Caravaggio's. And that painting of Bacchus is actually a self-portrait of Caravaggio's as well. The other idea that kind of popped into my head, and again, just based off of visual clues, is that he might be painting himself in his artist smock. And this is a photograph from around that time that shows what that would have looked like. So Self-Portrait 1921. This was a big year for Dalí. In 1921, his mother died from breast cancer. And so we see a lot of self-portraiture coming out of his work at this time. And it could be maybe because of this tragic event that just happened in his life, that he's really looking inward and experimenting with self-reflection and how he's crafting his image at this time. So this work appears to be unfinished, could be a study for the work that we're going to talk about next. But what's really interesting about it is this profile view that Dalí is working with here. On the back of this painting, he has notes, mathematical equations, and this one particular sketch that I found really intriguing. And so I make the case that he might have been looking to the painting of the Duke and Duchess of Urbino. and that very sharp profile view of those portraits. Dali's father had bought him a collection of art encyclopedias, and this painting would have been within that collection. And this is all building up to Self-Portrait 1921, which we are lucky enough to have right upstairs. The two images that you can see here are from the two photographs, excuse me, that you can see here are from a couple years later, but they help us understand what I like to call pre-makeover Dali. We've got the very dramatic hat, the pipe, the sharp chiaroscuro, the profile view, those very dramatic sideburns and brows are still very much present, that big black cloak. And there's a wonderful quote by Dalí himself from The Secret Life, which was written years after this was painted. And again, I just want to draw your attention to a few lines within it. I'd let my hair grow and wore it long like a girl's hair. Looking at myself in the mirror, I would often strike the poses and melancholy appearance of Raphael, to whom the greater resemblance I bore the better, as far as I was concerned. He makes reference to the large black felt hat and a pipe. He talks about how he didn't like trousers, so he decided to wear short pants with stockings, and he'd even wear a raincoat when it wasn't raining outside. So that leads us to the last line. Whenever I came out of my room or went back to it, groups of busybodies would gather to see me go by, and I would continue on my way with my head high, puffed up with pride. I think we can all, based off of that self-portrait, sort of see that image come to life. So again, Dalí, the student here, he's trying to present himself as artist in the studio, as an artist, sort of legitimizing his ambitions in life. He's looking to Rembrandt, who has that sharp chiaroscuro that you can see featured there, the light and dark. And they're even in kind of similar costumes with the hats and the darker garments. And then I couldn't help but, in my Rolodex of images in my brain, this one popped up, looking at Courbet. Now, I haven't found anything in my research that connects, at this point in his life, Dalí to Courbet. He wasn't one of the artists featured in the art encyclopedia, but I just can't help but see the similarities. From the black broad-brimmed hat, the black coat, Courbet is holding a pipe in his hand. It could be that Dalí has somehow seen this work, or it could be that they're both, at different times in history, also trying to create that image of what an artist is supposed to look like to them. And they both just sort of landed on the same conclusion. They do look a lot like each other, yeah. But I think Dalí definitely styled himself to look that way, for sure. Okay, so next up, Self-Portrait with Raphaelesque Neck from 1921. We just read in that quote from The Secret Life all about how Dalí tried to fashion himself off of Dalí, and here is a direct quote of Dalí's self-portraits, of Raphael's self-portraits to Dalí's self-portraits, excuse me, and especially in that elongation of the neck and the pose that we see that. We still have that impressionistic background, that Fauvist influence of those bright colors. The Sick Child from 1921. So in our collection, we have this as a work on paper, but the foundation in their Catalogue Raisonné, which is the collection of all of Dalí's works, has it in the painting category, so that's why I've included it today. I don't know if you've noticed up to this point, we have not talked about any works on paper, and that's because you could write volumes of books about Dalí's self-portraits on that medium as well. But The Sick Child, originally during Dalí's lifetime, was not identified as a self-portrait, but in the last couple years has come to be identified as such. And what I find so striking about it is that it really reminds me of the Saltimbanquis, which is an acrobat that Dalí also painted that year. And to look at the Saltimbanquis, you can't help but think about Picasso and the fact that he also painted this acrobat. And I'm gonna go back. Even the blue color can say it's a nod to Picasso's blue period. So here we see a shift. Dalí is no longer really looking at the Impressionists exclusively. He might have decided that maybe that's not the road he wants to travel, and he wants to experiment with different styles. And so he's looking at more modern masters to see what he can learn and how he can adapt from them. So from Saltimbanquis to Cubist self-portraits. Big leap in Dalí's life as well. We're in Madrid. We're in art school. We're looking at Picasso, obviously, and there's actually a portrait, done by Picasso around the same time, a couple years earlier, I believe, that showcases that same quality of the face sort of still being intact, almost mask-like, and then it's surrounded by all of those geometric, abstract shapes that are so telling of Cubism. We're still looking at Picasso later that year with Self-Portrait with l'Humanité. This is from 1923, so we're still in art school. And Dalí here is painting himself a little bit differently. We're dropped the trappings of what we think the great master artist must look like, and now he's painting himself as a worker. In the background, we actually have collaged pieces of a communist newspaper that's called l'Humanité. And then again, we still are coming back to those bold brows and those sideburns as the identifying features for Dalí. I guess this is before he could grow a mustache. During this time, Dalí may have also been looking at another contemporary artist named Rafael Barradas. This is a painting that he did of Garcia Lorca, who would become Dalí's very close friend, and we'll talk about him in just a moment. And Barradas is obviously using kind of the same conventions when showing the face, with very little attention to features besides those bold brows and eyes. Barradas was a South American artist who was living in Madrid at the time and traveled in many of the same circles as Dalí, so that's how he might have seen his work. 1924 is an important year for Dalí because he was actually expelled the year before from school. He led a walkout and was charged with inciting a riot. He was unhappy with a professor that had been named to teach. And after some time back home, he comes back to Madrid, and this is his student ID from 1924 to 1925. We can see that we still have the long hair, all the same kind of characteristic facial hair that we've exploring so far. But then something happens in 1924, and we get post-makeover Dalí, Dalí the glow-up, if you will. And here he has gotten a haircut. He's fallen into a new group of friends who are artists and writers who will go on to do amazing things. And Lorca has become his very best friend, and we see them pictured here in these photographs. This is significant when we look at the painting that he's doing a few years later in 26 and 27. There are actually a couple canvases that play off of this same motif of multiple faces either coming together or splitting apart. This one is called Self-Portrait Splitting into Three. In 26, Lorca would have spent the summer with Dalí's family in Catechas, and to me, this painting really shows their identities kind of melding together to create a new person. There's much speculation about if they had a romantic relationship. That's talk for another time. But for the purposes of today, it's just important to know that they were spending a lot of time together at the time that this work was created, and that this is really, I think, indicative of how Dalí seems to always need to tie his identity to something or someone else. In the future, it will be Gala, his wife. So, big leap, 1929. This is right before he becomes officially a surrealist. He becomes a part of the surrealist movement. He's read Freud, as you can probably tell by all of the symbols that are decorating the composition here in this work. This is also in our collection. And to me, it's a bridge piece. between this first period of his self-portraiture and the next one that we're about to discuss. And it's because there are two self-portraits within it. One is a collaged photograph of himself as a child, and then the second one is what will be called the soft self-portrait or great masturbator. And I've circled them both in the composition and then zoomed in on them so you can see in greater detail. The great masturbator or soft self-portrait, the name says it all. It's all about showing the skin, the exterior, and this is Dalí's first stab at creating this new icon, this new symbol of himself. Later on in that year, we have sort of the fully realized face of the great masturbator. And just to remember this for future reference, focus on that grasshopper that's on his face, because that will be coming up again in his self-portraits. What's interesting, I think, there are many things, obviously, that are interesting about this surrealist symbol for Dalí, but the source of inspiration for it, I think, is really important. One of the theories, and thank you, Peter, by the way, for all the countless times you sat through this lecture before and for pointing me in this direction, but I can't help, and neither could Peter, to look back at Michelangelo and St. Bartholomew and that idea of just showing the skin, the outside stuff, instead of focusing on the internal structure. In this case, Dalí is showing you the outside to make it, strange and whimsical and focus on the idea of dreams. But he'll be using this in a different way much later in his career. The other source of inspiration for Dalí is and will always be catechese. This is a wonderful quote from the Unspeakable Confessions of Salvador Dalí. "This country is my permanent inspiration, the only place in the world where I feel loved. When I painted that rock that I dubbed the Great Masturbator, I was merely marking out one of the landmarks of my kingdom, and the picture was a tribute to one of the jewels of my crown." So this is a photograph of the head of Curator. Catechese was a fishing town, and many of the fishermen would have names for the different rock formations that they saw. I remember growing up in Puerto Rico that there was a rock that looked like a dog, and every time we drove to Old San Juan, we'd say, "Hey, there's the dog," and the dog was very sad waiting for its owner that went out to sea and never returned. I don't think that dog, unfortunately, survived the hurricanes that have come our way, but I can certainly relate to that idea of connection of place that Dalí is using here as his source of inspiration for the soft self-portrait or great masturbator. So, we're moving to his next period, Hidden Dalí, Anxiety and Allegory, 1931 to 1954. And this is going to take us through Dalí's surrealist period as well as the Spanish Civil War and World War II and his time in the United States. This section really focuses on how Dalí is working through sex as a source of anxiety, and we'll see that come up in many of his self-portraits. And he really develops that lexicon of symbols and Freudian allegories as his self-portraiture. The first work that really demonstrates this is William Tell from 1930. So you can argue that Dalí is not pictured here. But this is how he's using that allegory to work through his phobias and fears and to represent himself. So there's a great photograph from around this time that shows Dalí with a sea urchin on their head. And for anybody who needs a refresher on the tale of William Tell, he didn't bow to a political figure that had walked by, and as punishment, he was arrested and told that he needed to shoot an apple off of his son's head. If he refused, both of them would be executed. Well, he ends up being able to successfully shoot the apple off. But what Dalí is really focusing on isn't the conclusion of the tale, but that idea of the father endangering the son's life. Dalí had a very contentious relationship with his father at this time. His dad was not happy with the direction that his art was going. He had also met Gala, his wife, not a fan of hers. And a lot of Dali's phobias come from his childhood, and particularly one story of his father placing medical textbooks with venereal diseases on the family piano as a way to teach him about the birds and the bees. So thank you, Mom, for not doing that. So here we have Dali, and I argue that he is the figure in the foreground who is pointing back at the figure that's in the background that's holding the scissors. Dali's genital area is covered, and that could be as a sign or a signal of this fear of castration that might be coming from the father figure and the scissors. And you can give a whole talk about William Tell and a couple other paintings that we'll talk about in this section, but for the purposes of today, we're just focusing on those elements of self-portraiture. The Persistence of Memory, 1931. This is the textbook surrealist image. And when I say textbook, I mean literally. You will open up an art history textbook and you will probably find The Persistence of Memory. The work is a beautiful surrealist work, using juxtaposition to convey soft and hard and put them in contrast to each other. It conveys a dreamlike scene. Our soft self-portrait here has its eyes closed. Those melting clocks inspired by melting cheese that Dali saw on a hot summer day also challenge that idea of the permanence of time. So here we have Dali, fully realized surrealist artist, still using his self-portrait as a vehicle for conveying bigger ideas. The Specter of Sex Appeal from the year later introduces us to a new Dalinian symbol that's also about self-portraiture, and it is the little sailor boy that we see in the corner who's looking up at this decaying sack of limbs and meat that is the Specter of Sex Appeal. And then we know this is Dali because we actually have a photograph of him in the same dress as his childhood. And my husband would kill me if I put my son in that these days. But obviously very cute on Dali, and also very significant for him that he would return to that image of himself. These two works, their current location is unknown, which is why, again, we have just black and white images of them. But they're done in 1933, and both of them feature our little sailor boy. And they also have Lucia, his nanny, sitting next to him, and probably set in the beaches of Catechaz. So very common motifs for Dali at the time. Myself at the age of 10, where I was a grasshopper child. Remember when I said, think about that grasshopper that was on The Great Masturbator? Here he is again. Story goes that Dali was holding a fish one day that was alive, and it transformed before him into a grasshopper, and he had a lifelong phobia of them. Now the story is coming from Dali's mouth itself, so who knows how real that actually is, but it explains why Dali has placed the grasshopper in the little sailor suit from his Dalinian symbol that we just discussed. And then just a gentle reminder there of our grasshopper way back from the very first appearance of soft self-portrait is present. Metamorphosis of Narcissus from 1937. So there's an entire book written about this work. So obviously we're not going to delve into all the nitty-gritty details of it, but it's stunning and very significant in Dali's biography, because it's the work that he actually took to Freud when he met him, and Freud was Dali's hero at the time. So in this work, Dali, much like in William Tell, is using allegory to discuss himself. So 1937, he is a famous artist at this time. He is a media star. He's been on the cover of Time magazine. And in a way, he is the arch Narcissus. Narcissus is a Greek tale of a young, beautiful man who had multiple suitors chasing him, but he rejected all of them. And so the gods cursed him for his hubris and told him to made him fall in love, with his image reflected in a pool of water. They finally took pity on him because, of course, he was devastated that he couldn't hold his image because it was a reflection, and turned him into a flower. And so Dalí is showing us that moment of metamorphosis here. And it's also not the first time, but one of the times that we're seeing kind of a fully realized work where he's using the paranoid critical method, that ability to look at something once and then look at it again and see something different. And as a visual clue for us, he's shown the hand holding the egg in the foreground, and then further in the background is the figure of Narcissus himself, but it could also be a hand holding a walnut. Give everybody a chance to take a look there. He's the figure that has his legs kind of in the water. Someone was asking where Narcissus is located, yeah. Okay. So, impressions of Africa. Buckle up, because I went down a research rabbit hole on this one. This to me was so fascinating because it really breaks from that neat little box that I like to put Dalí in for this period. But that's the wonder and magic of Dalí, right? That he never lets us put him in a little box. Impression of Africa is a fascinating work. Dalí had never been to Africa. He had read a book that had the title Impression of Africa, which is probably a source of inspiration. But in Innovation Labs, we like to talk about opening up new possibility spaces and how oftentimes it's easier for us to be creative and imagine something that we've never seen before, like a Pluto sunset versus a normal Earth sunset. We'll come up with much more creative interpretations of Pluto than we will of something that we can see in our own backyard here in Florida. So I think this idea of painting Africa was that opportunity for him to open up that possibility space and do something new and different. But Dalí is actually showing himself in a corporal manner. He isn't an allegory, he isn't a symbol, and that's sort of the tradition, the convention that he's following at this time in his career. So he had just been to Italy. He'd spent 2 months in Rome, where we can only assume that, of course, he went to see the great masters that had always been his heroes, like Michelangelo and Raphael. So here we have a sketch that Dalí did to kind of understand how his body needed to be positioned behind the canvas. And then we have a sketch done by Raphael of those outstretched hands that he would have done as a preparatory sketch for a painting he did of 2 apostles. So sources of inspiration, possibly. I had a lot of fun trying to figure this one out. And again, I can't help myself but go back to Courbet, the desperate man. This is from 1843 to 45, and Courbet did many self-portraits where he really experimented with expressions on his face. And it's that big open eye, the bold brow, that we can see through Dalí's hand on his face, really highlighted. And then, of course, we'll be coming back to Velázquez a few more times in this talk. But Velázquez was a Spanish painter, also one of Dalí's heroes. And Las Meninas was an endless source of inspiration for Dalí that he quoted and went back to multiple times in his career. And it's that idea of the artist behind the canvas that Dalí is quoting here. And he'll do that again, as I just said. Okay, so Daddy Longlegs of the Evening Hope. You'll get to see that upstairs as well. It's the first painting that Dalí does as a resident here in the United States after he fled the Spanish Civil War and World War II. And we see the soft self-portrait or great masturbator in the center there, connected to this drooping, decaying body. But for me, there's a shift here with how he's using this Dalinian symbol. It's 1940. He's not a member of the Surrealist movement any longer, though obviously he's still painting in a Surrealist style. And he goes from thinking about the soft self-portrait as a Dalinian symbol, a Freudian symbol of psychoanalysis. And to me, he's placing it in a scene where it's conveying more of a social narrative, a historical narrative. He's surrounded by symbols of death, destruction, and war. And so it's a bit less about internally what's going on in Dalí and a bit more about what's happening externally in the world that is affecting him. Soft Self-Portrait with Grilled Bacon, 1941. At some point in your life, you will encounter somebody that has this tattooed on themselves. It's just one of those Dalí images that has really worked its way into kind of our collective cultural self-conscious. Here he's calling it the soft self-portrait. It's literally listed on the plinth at the bottom. Our soft self-portrait, our great masturbator, seems extra droopy and needs that support of the crutches. We have crutches of all different sizes. In my research, and I put this with a caveat, that when I told Peter this, he wasn't convinced, but in my research I did come upon a couple instances where they talked about how crutches were so popular amongst Dalí's collectors that he just thought, maybe I'll just add a couple more, and it'll make it sell really well. That being said, take it with a grain of salt. That might not be the case, but I wouldn't put it past him. The piece of bacon would have been something that he says he would have eaten at breakfast every day when he was staying at the St. Regis Hotel in New York. But here we have Dalí, the great artist. He is at peak fame, and he is presenting himself like that slab of bacon up for our consumption. And so I think, again, just like Daddy Longlegs, Soft Self-Portrait with Grilled Bacon is using the soft self-portrait in a different capacity. It's giving us a different message. And that brings us to Michelangelo. Again, that drooping outer layer is very much just an outer layer. And that takes us to our third and final section of Dalí's self-portraiture, Dalí as master, apotheosis and reflection. So this is from 1952 to 1981. 81 is actually the year where he paints his very last self-portrait. This takes us through his nuclear mystical period. So he's moving away from Freud and psychoanalysis and looking at religion, specifically Catholicism, and science as sources of inspiration. And he's really trying to place himself, I think, within the history of the great masters of art. So the disintegration of the persistence of memory. 20 years later, Dalí is painting a follow-up piece, a second version of the persistence of memory. And we're, again, lucky enough to have this in our collection. Here we have the soft self-portrait once more, but this time it looks amorphous, anemic, transparent. It's barely there. So Dalí is really turning away from that as a symbol of psychoanalysis and really rejecting that and moving to a new period in his career. Dalí, nude, entranced in the contemplation of 5 regular bodies metamorphosed in corpuscles in which suddenly Leonardo's Leda chromosomatized by the face of Gala. And that'll be the only time I'm going to attempt one of these very long titles that Dalí gives his works during this period, because he makes up his own language. This is from 1954, and we have, again, a full corporal representation of Dalí, but I couldn't help but think about how he's really reflecting back on his career. He's still seeing himself as a student. There's a photograph of him trying to work out that pose that he wants for his body in this work. And then I couldn't help but think back to William Tell, specifically that fear of castration that, Dali once again is hiding from us. Christopher Columbus from 1958. Again, Dali's in his nuclear mystical period, so a lot of inspiration from history and Catholicism. This is the moment that Columbus sets foot on shore in the United States, and it could be argued that this is the apotheosis, that peak moment where Dali's fame really takes off in the United States. He's depicted himself as a monk, holding a crucifix in prayer, and going back to that idea of artist in disguise. He is hiding, yes, but he's still smack dab in the middle of the action. Ecumenical Council from 1960. We have Dali pictured in the corner, artist at work. You can't help but again think of Velázquez and Las Meninas. And what I found so inspiring about Dali's self-portraiture here is that he has placed us in the same position, us the viewer, in the same position as Velázquez has placed the King and Queen of Spain. The King and Queen of Spain are pictured in the mirror in the background, just behind the Infanta's head. Give everybody a chance to spot that. And so Velázquez, this was, groundbreaking that when he did this, placed the viewer in the position of the king and queen. Dali is placing us in that same position as a viewer of the scene before us, of this divine scene that is pictured in Ecumenical Council. So this is a great work that's a lot of fun to talk about. Perpignan Railway Station. I will not read the 64 words that make up the title. Time is precious. But the story behind this work is just so fun. Dali was supposedly at this railway station, and he had a cosmic vision where he felt like he was at the center of the universe. And why not then place himself at the center of this painting? This pose is based off of a photograph that he did with Philip Halsman, I believe just the year before, where Dali is on a transparent platform, the photographer's below, and then it looks like a helicopter is about to lift off and just grab him by his upper lip. Yeah, or his mustache, yeah. So Dali has taken that photograph as inspiration and placed it in the center. And funny enough, just a few years ago, you can now visit this railway station and you will be treated to a statue of Dali in the same pose. So this station is just a few miles from where Dali is from, in Catalonia, and it's a very important station because everybody who's traveling between France and Spain will probably change trains here. So it could be in many ways that that's why Dali felt it was the center of the universe. It certainly felt like the center of his universe, and it felt like Catalonia was the center of the universe to him. Okay, apotheosis of the dollar. Again, a lot going on in this work, but we're really just going to be focusing on the image that Dali has chosen to present of himself here. And oftentimes it's, again, seen as a reference to Velázquez, but in my mind, the title itself actually makes reference. I'm going to go back a slide. The title itself makes a reference to Vermeer with that Vermeerian curtain. So that's what triggered in my mind this image of the allegory of painting by Vermeer. And also, it just makes sense that Dali would think of Gala as the embodiment of art. And also that back view of placing us behind the artist, and us seeing that moment of creation of him actually painting Gala. into existence on the canvas, I think is quite beautiful, and just like what Vermeer is doing himself. The Hallucinogenic Toreador from 1970. This work is very retrospective in my mind for Dalí. And it's so fun to talk about on tours and with people, and there's so much going on. But again, for the purposes of this talk, we're just going to be focusing on how he's chosen to represent himself in this work. And that's looking back at the use of his Delinean symbol as the little sailor boy. Dali Seen from the Back Painting Gala from the Back Eternalized by 6 virtual corneas, provisionally reflected by 6 real mirrors. Dalí did about 5 or 6, I believe, stereoscopic works of this time. So you're supposed to be able to look at both, and if you kind of cross your eyes, they become 3-dimensional. Throughout this whole period of his career, he's really been experimenting with dimensionality. It's that idea, that influence of physics and understanding the world and how to paint it that really draws him to that. What I think is so fabulous about this work is not only do we have artist at work, one of our traditions, we're seeing him from behind, right? But then we have the mirror and we get to see him reflected there. And he's got those big open eyes that are so characteristic of Dalí from his photographs and his paintings. And I would argue he's looking at Courbet to maybe come up with that image. But also Gala's in the little sailor suit. Yeah. So think back to that self-portrait of splitting into 3 or becoming one. Again, tying his identity to someone else, and for most of his life, that very much was Gala. So 1981 was a pretty tragic year for Dalí. He had a very steep decline in his health. Gala, who herself was older, was going senile and chose to give Dalí a cocktail of unprescribed medications that had, unfortunately, a very adverse reaction in his neurological system. And so he started to shake as if he had Parkinson's. So the next work that we're going to see is his last self-portrait done in that year. Yeah, you can feel the mood here. Untitled, Looking at the Great Masturbator. This is at the Reina Sofia, and it's not very often seen. I found it looking through the catalog raisonné, going literally year by year, trying to pull all the self-portraits out in just my very early research stage. So I argue that we have 2 Dalís here. We have soft self-portrait, great masturbator, not so great anymore. Shriveled up, looking not as detailed or sharp as he has in the past. Just kind of looking listless. And then I would argue that we have Dalí looking down at the soft self-portrait, the figure that has the hand on the forehead, the hair, and I'll go back to the photograph, very similar to how Dalí was styling it at the time, was wearing it at the time. And I mean, it just this feeling of helplessness that comes through this work. Most of the paintings from this year are unfinished, much like this canvas is. And so even at the very end of his career, he goes on to die in 1989, so he still has 8 years of work ahead of him. But it's a tragic and hard 8 years ahead, and this is the beginning of that downturn. And I think this self-portrait, in a way, even goes back to his surrealist roots and thinking about how Dalí is trying to show us internally what's going on in his life. So in conclusion, no one better to sum it up than Dalí himself. The day that people begin to study my work seriously, they will see that my painting is like an iceberg, of which only 1/10 of its volume is visible. I work Jesuitically to hide my true worth using Jesuit hypocrisy as a magistral technique. Thus, my exhibitionism masks my true personality. So it kind of feels like last hour was a waste of time, according to Dalí. But it was sure fun trying to figure out how his self-portraiture came to be, what the sources of inspiration for it were, how it fits into the larger art historical narrative, and what Dalí is trying to tell us about what was going on in his life or what his interests and fascinations were. So with that, I leave you to hopefully go out and look at more Dalí self-portraits and try to unmask the master. Thank you.